Space science, like nuclear science and all technology, has no conscience of its own. Whether it will become a force for good or ill depends on man. And only if the United States occupies a position of preeminence can we help decide whether this new ocean will be a sea of peace or a new terrifying theater of war.
China carried out its first anti-satellite weapons test on an old weather satellite about 500 miles up.
According to U.S. government officials, after 3 misses, China succeeded in shooting down one of its own aging weather satellites.
The test may be part of China's efforts to establish a military presence in space. Does this mean the spy satellites the United States depends on could be shot down?
They left behind a trail of garbage circling in orbit now after they blew up the satellite.
It could leave us vulnerable. It could cripple us. Is that what they're up to?
There are nations out there who are hostile to us, and they are in space.
The threat to our space security is real. Security in space is a vital national interest. The loss of access to space would threaten the very stability of our nation.
If aimed at commercial satellites, and such an attack could bring U.S. business and industry to a halt.
Today, China warned that a shooting war in space would affect everyone on Earth.
Space could get more crowded, and we're going to need to have control and defensive measures.
A treaty banning space weapons has failed. A space war is in the cards.
Space is the backbone of our national security. There is no substitute, and there is no alternative to military dominance in space. This conviction should drive our course for the next 50 years.
In the mid-20th century, humanity spun its first satellite into orbit. Staking this new frontier provided a new arena for war. Still, space is unscarred by battle, a sanctuary. But humanity's compulsion to dominate may ravage the expanse embracing our world, and the world itself. Whom can we trust to regulate our heavens?
Caesar Augustus came to power 27 years before Christ was born. People in the Roman Empire lived better under Caesar Augustus than they had in any empire on earth during any previous time. Roads improved, pirates no longer threatened ships on the high seas. Life was so good during this time that the period acquired a name. It was and is still referred to as the Pax Romana, which means the Roman peace. Another period of peace has acquired a name. It is called the Pax Americana, or the American peace. It refers to the period in which American influence throughout the world has caused a relative peace to come about. Nowadays, it seems the Pax Americana is threatened. Most of us only feel peace when we're not at war, but peace means the presence of a risen and alive Lord in your life. You may walk out every morning into a war zone. The Lord won't take you out of the valley of the shadow of death, but He will lead you right through it. And so it says in Isaiah 54, though the mountains be shaken and the hills removed, yet my unfailing love for you will not be shaken, nor my covenant of peace be removed.
My name is Cadet First Class Colton Tuttle. I'm a cadet at the Air Force Academy. I graduate in 44 days, and I'm just hoping to do my part to make sure that everyone here can enjoy their freedoms.
Pax Americana is a political view which simply says that because America is currently the sole superpower, that it has not only the ability but the responsibility into the far future to maintain world peace.
Eyes! Right! I think our country has always played a key role in maintaining world peace, and now that responsibility also extends into space. And so when countries like the Chinese start attacking space assets, it could lead to a serious crisis. Hopefully we can talk to them before they start making a big mess.
The United States, and particularly its intelligence services, worry about an attack on the United States that is not nuclear weapons, that is not chemicals, that is not biological, but is technological.
Global communications are embedded in our daily lives. Miles above our heads, beyond our awareness, satellites manage our hyper-connected society.
If you look at space, lots of times you think about the Hubble telescope or, Mars probes, but most people don't realize that they use space every day. When you open your cell phone to make a call, when you take money out of the bank with your ATM card, satellite bring you your TV shows and live news from around the world. You use them each time you rely on a positioning system for air, for sea, for land traffic control, and even in your own car. There would be no weather forecasting, disaster monitoring without satellites. Our entire life depends on satellites. They're essential, but we're not conscious of that until we lose it.
Today, at least 1,000 active satellites circle the Earth. "45 nations own these satellites, and most of the world uses their signals. But the United States dominates as the owner and user of space systems, both civilian and military.
Bombs on target, real-time battle management. That's what we're about, and that's what we are able to deliver through space, air, land, and sea, and the capability of all of those to come together. We started that in Desert Storm. We've done that in each conflict since, and we get better and better and better.
Since the first Gulf War, the use of space has become vital to all U.S. military operations. In the Second Gulf War, during the shock and awe air attack on Baghdad, the United States used satellites to guide 71% of all the missiles it fired. Space is the backbone of American military power. Or is it? It's Achilles' heel.
A surprise attack in space. This is the ultimate nightmare. By knocking out 50 U.S. military satellites, the Chinese could literally cripple the U.S. military. They could prevent the military from being able to communicate with its forces. They could blind the U.S. intelligence community, which uses electro-optic satellites to determine military force movements around the world. And they could also cripple the guidance systems that are used on precision-guided munitions that are satellite-guided. In many senses, it could be a kind of an electronic Pearl Harbor. Without space, the U.S. would be unable to conduct any type of military operation in an effective way.
There's a tremendous premium on the United States being able to prevent other people from attacking our assets in space and to ensure that we can continue to exercise full use of them and, if necessary, also to be able to deny others use of similar assets for their own purposes.
The world has changed. As more and more countries develop a presence in outer space, the possibility of a space battle is no longer science fiction. Our new world requires new solutions. Meet U.S. Air Force Space Command. This elite force is America's eye in the sky, keeping watch over our interests high above the ground.
Denial implies the use of force.
Weapons from space to the ground.
As China recognizes that the military dominance of the United States is utterly reliant upon space.
The United States is going to become the world's policeman. Does that title resonate with you? Do you have any reactions to that? Do you think it's accurate? If it were accurate, how would it play out?
If you look at what was one of the first roles of the United States Navy when it was established was combating piracy.
Absolutely.
And if you look at potential commerce in space, law enforcement and things like that are going to be an important mission.
As more and more countries start using space for security purposes and military purposes, sooner or later they're going to collide, and sooner or later space will become another arena for warfare, for good or bad, and the same kind of ethics that we apply to military force in the other environments will apply to space.
You can obviously stretch any analogy to the breaking point, but the space-sea analogy, I think, is one of the more useful.
As the Dutch controlled the seas in the 1700s, as the British tended to police and control the seas from the 1800s and 1900s, and as the United States has done in the 20th century and will do in the 21st century, and that is to ensure that commerce is unfettered, pirates and others, should they be out there, are taken out. We can do the same thing for space. We can do so in a way that is good for everyone and is good for ourselves. It is policing the heavens for the good of all.
May I have the spelling of your vessel's name, Captain?
Few object when the United States Navy deploys hundreds of heavily armed warships in every one of the world's oceans. No one accuses us of contributing to the weaponization of the sea because they know that the presence of our weapons ensures free transit for all who pursue their peaceful interests. U.S. systems based in space could similarly patrol the commons for the good of all.
The U.S. Air Force has been charged with the mission of ensuring space access and denying space access in times of conflict. Can the United States Air Force do this mission without weapons?
What constitutes a space weapon? How much do we know about the ability of the United States to police the heavens and deny access to others?
Starfire has been used primarily in the past to do research on satellite tracking. Also, they've done a lot of work in astronomy with range finding of stars. So you use the laser to be able to help tell you where the star is and how far away it is. In the budget documents from the Air Force, there has also been mention of the use of Starfire for anti-satellite weapons activities. The Air Force told Congress that it had no intentions of using Starfire for anything related to anti-satellite weapons. However, they are doing a test to make the laser beam very skinny and make it stay very stable as it goes up, and they're going to target that on a satellite. If you're tracking a satellite, you don't need a very skinny laser beam. In fact, you want kind of a wide one because you want to make sure you catch it in the view, right? So many of us here are concerned that this kind of a test is actually an anti-satellite weapons test in disguise.
In April of 2005, the Air Force launched an experimental satellite. Its name was the XSS-11. Theoretically, this experimental microsatellite has the ability to disrupt other nations' satellites. Has it done so? No. Could it do so? En principe, okay? But in reality, we don't know.
One of the things that I think people need to know is that most technology that's used in space can be used either for weapons purposes or it can be used for totally benign, good purposes. Lasers for tracking, good idea, more precise tracking. Small microsatellites that can go around a big satellite and take pictures, good idea, because it helps you figure out what went wrong with your satellite, and that's hard to do right now. Good idea. That same little microsatellite that's going around the big satellite could be sent up to go around another person's satellite and run into it and kill it. The technology doesn't know whether it's a weapon or whether it's a benign use. The question is going to come down to the intent of the people who are building these systems.
How can we discern peaceful or hostile intentions for any system projected into space? How can we know that the weaponization of space hasn't already begun?
I'm the permanent professor and head of the Department of Astronautics here at the Air Force Academy. And we've been continually teaching the fundamentals of astronautics to our cadets. And every cadet that has graduated from the Air Force Academy, almost 40,000 now, have taken at least one course in our department.
This area right here, what's that called? Bow shock, right. And superimposed on this, of course, we have a HEO, highly elliptic orbit.
In military strategy, it shows that if you want to control the battlefield, you need to be the first in seizing the high ground, the most advanced frontier. Whether it be land, sea, air, and now space, the person that controls that has the advantage. So making sure that we can deny our enemies space is a huge advantage.
Military forces have always relied upon high ground technologies to gain advantages. In our own Civil War in the United States, troops in the Army, especially in the Union Army, used hot air balloons to get above the trees and see where the enemy was. And of course, the first airplanes to be used in World War I were essentially reconnaissance craft. They were designed to fly up and look and see where the enemy was placed.
Space then has been called the ultimate high ground, and the advantage to the state that can seize and maintain the high ground is the same as holding the high ground throughout history, whether that was a hill, a mountain, or in the latter half of the 20th century, the air space.
September 6, 1944, armed with over a ton of high explosive, Germany's first tactical rocket, now called the V-2, the vengeance weapon, is fired at London.
Hitler's army pioneered the new high ground with the V-2 rocket. Vengeance Weapon 2 was the first man-made object projected through space, en route to targets in Europe.
Cette fusée a été développée dans le cadre du Troisième Reich. Elle a été utilisée par les armées nazies. À la fin de la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, c'était les SS qui étaient en charge d'assurer la réalisation du programme. Les travailleurs qui étaient là, pour une bonne partie, étaient des travailleurs des camps de concentration, avec un des pires camps de concentration de la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, qui est le camp de Dora.
A young SS officer, Werner von Braun, was chief engineer for the design and manufacture of the V-2. This first ballistic missile sparked the interest of a rich patron beyond Germany.
La V2, c'est vraiment considéré à la fin de la guerre comme quelque chose qu'il fallait absolument prendre aussi bien par les soviétiques que par les occidentaux. Et donc von Braun a été récupéré avec une centaine de ses meilleurs ingénieurs dans le cadre d'une opération qui s'appelait Opération Paperclip, c'était le nom de code. Il a été transporté aux États-Unis.
The Pentagon commissioned von Braun and his team of German rocketeers to design an improved version of the V-2. Von Braun spearheaded production of the Redstone, the first American ballistic missile. It propelled him to the highest sphere of military and scientific influence.
Werner von Braun ultimately became associate director of NASA, and his former Nazi scientists functioned as collaborators with the U.S. military in looking towards space as a new arena of war.
Gentlemen, will you please take your seats so we can begin today's conference? I take a great deal of pleasure in presenting to you today as our guest speaker, Dr. Werner von Braun.
Gentlemen, the conquest of outer space is the greatest technological challenge of the age in which we live. On the right side of this picture, you see a large wheel-shaped space station. This, of course, offers tremendous possibilities to reconnaissance, and both in the civilian sense as in the military sense.
These Nazi scientists, these Nazi space scientists that came to this country under Project Paperclip, developed schemes to essentially control the Earth from space with space-based weapons.
It seems even feasible to use such a platform in space as a base for the bombing of objects on the ground. And it is my opinion that such bombing could be carried out with an unprecedented accuracy from such a station.
La plupart des ingénieurs allemands qui ont été ainsi, qui sont partis ainsi aux États-Unis, ont été pendant quelques années considérés avec une certaine suspicion, mais ensuite ils sont devenus citoyens américains et ils ont joué un rôle dans le développement de l'espace aux États-Unis, moins des missiles. Et von Braun, donc, plus tard, est devenu le grand responsable de la construction des fusées géantes Saturne.
Then, October 4th, 1957, Russia shocks the free world. The USSR hurls into orbit the world's first Earth satellite, Sputnik 1. The Soviets are now the unquestionable leaders in the race for space.
We've been assigned the mission of launching a scientific Earth satellite. I promised the Secretary of the Army that we would be ready in 90 days or less. Let's go, Werner.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4.
Werner von Braun met the U.S. military's 90-day deadline. His modified V-2 launched the first American satellite into orbit. The space race was on.
News is flashed of the long-awaited event. America has her satellite in orbit.
How would nations legislate this new realm?
Well, I joined the American Diplomatic Service in 1958, and I was assigned to the United Nations Political Office, and I was 22 years old. I was the youngest Foreign Service officer in the State Department, and they said, why don't you handle the multilateral aspects of our space program? We just put our first satellites into space, and they said, you're in charge. And I said, you've got to be kidding, I'm only 22. And they said, that's your job.
Today, outer space is free. It is unscarred by conflict. No nation holds a concession there. It must remain this way.
Nothing was settled when we started. For instance, who owns outer space? Who owns the moon? Who owns Mars? Was it the situation like Columbus discovering the New World? And he says, I lay claim to America
in the name of the King and Queen of Spain.
Could we do that? Could the Russians do that? So that was a big question. And the other question is, are we going to use outer space for peaceful purposes or for military and aggressive purposes?
We must develop new concepts which enable us, let's say something like 10 years from now, to land parties on the moon to decide whether we want to have a base on the moon for scientific or military purposes. And
we thought to ourselves, can't there be one part, one sector that is free of weapons? But when it got to the peaceful uses question, I ran into the Department of Defense, and they said, no, we don't want to give up the idea of putting weapons into outer space. We'll go along with not having weapons of mass destruction in outer space, but we're not going to sign on a treaty where we can't put up weapons. I lost, the State Department lost, the Department of Defense won, and we ended up with a treaty, the 1967 treaty, which said you can't orbit weapons of mass destruction, but it did not prohibit other weapons.
World leaders, compelled by the influence of the Defense Department, endorsed the militarization of space. Nuclear weapons were now banned from space, but on Earth, they were proliferating.
With both sections of this divided world in possession of unbelievably destructive weapons, mankind approaches a state where mutual annihilation becomes a possibility. Earth satellites, in themselves, have no direct present effect upon the nation's security. However, there is real military significance to these launchings.
Dreading nuclear attack, the US and USSR longed to know the position and power of its enemy stockpiles. Each dispatched satellites to spy, day and night, over the other's arsenal. The military contest to occupy the ultimate high ground had begun. The United States plotted the next step to weaponize space, covertly, in the early 80s.
June 12, 1982. There was a huge demonstration in New York City that day. Almost 1 million people were protesting against nuclear weapons. At that time, the height of the Cold War between the United States and the former Soviet Union. I watched it on television. And after it was over, they cut away to a right-wing conference. And the speaker that day was a man by the name of Lieutenant General Daniel Graham. And at that time, he was Ronald Reagan's head of SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative. Someone said, General Graham, aren't you worried about that demonstration in New York today? They say there's almost 1 million people there protesting against nuclear weapons. He said, no, I think it's fantastic. They're out there protesting against intercontinental ballistic missiles, and we're moving into space. They don't have a clue. Let them keep doing what they're doing.
What if we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies? It will take years, probably decades of effort on many fronts. There'll be failures and setbacks, just as there will be successes and breakthroughs. But isn't it worth every investment necessary to free the world from the threat of nuclear war? My fellow Americans, Tonight, we're launching an effort which holds the promise of changing the course of human history. I ask for your prayers and your support. Thank you. Good night.
When I joined the staff of the Committee on Armed Services in the U.S. House of Representatives back in 1985, my first assignment was to investigate and oversee the Strategic Defense Initiative. This was President Ronald Reagan's Star Wars program.
This new national strategy represents a break from the dangerous policy of mutual assured destruction.
In Ronald Reagan's version of Star Wars, the new space shuttle would deploy the force.
When our reconnaissance systems verify a Soviet launch, U.S. interceptors are fired as Level 1 defense goes into action.
Batteries of orbiting weapons would be poised to defeat a nuclear attack before it reached U.S. airspace.
At the time, the prevailing view was that this was going to work, that the technology was almost in hand, and that this was going to change everything. I remember the briefing I got from my staff director who said not just anti-missile systems, but all major weapon systems were going to move to space, that space was the new high ground. Even then we talked about it in that way, where all major military operations were going to be by the end of that century.
It was a debate of stellar proportions. The nation's #1 stargazer versus the Pentagon's chief of Star Wars.
It cannot protect the population of the United States. It can be, by the Soviets, overwhelmed, outfoxed, underflown.
I, for one, am not willing and able to just accept the idea that it can't work.
Most Star Wars plans proved too fanciful and went no further than animations devised for publicity. But the U.S. military stayed committed to Star Wars. As the U.S. became the sole superpower, the Pentagon maintained its plan to use space weapons against enemy attacks. Star Wars resurfaced in the early 21st century under a new name: missile defense.
We need a new framework that allows us to build missile defenses to counter the different threats of today's world.
I hope we'll also move forward on ballistic missile defense cooperation.
We must develop and we must deploy effective missile defenses.
Back in 2000, when President Bush took office, he and his cadre of people that surrounded him, you think of Paul Wolfowitz, you think of Donald Rumsfeld, you think of Dick Cheney, all of them really only had two priorities. One was to get rid of Saddam Hussein. The second was to build a missile defense system.
Good morning. I've just concluded a meeting of my National Security Council. We reviewed what I've discussed with my friend, President Vladimir Putin, over the course of many meetings, many months, and that is the need for America to move beyond the 1972 anti-ballistic missile treaty.
When George W. Bush became president, immediately he gave 6-month notice to Russia that we're pulling out, the United States is pulling out of the ABM treaty, the anti-ballistic missile treaty, that limited the United States' ability to test and deploy anti-satellite weapons, so-called missile defense systems, and other space technology.
At the Pentagon today, a warning that space will become the next big battlegrounds. To meet the challenge, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld is making space a top Pentagon priority, putting a 4-star general at the head of a new Air Force Space Command to take charge of all military space activity, including any new anti-missile defense.
Pay careful attention to protecting, promoting our interest in space.
Pentagon officials say it's the first step toward eventually putting weapons into space.
Mr. Secretary, the budget proposes spending $8.3 billion on the full range of ballistic missile defense programs. This is an increase over last year of nearly 60%, or $3 billion.
It is a lot of the taxpayers' money. On the other hand, the President intends to have ballistic missile defense to protect the population centers of the United States as well as of our friends and allies and deployed forces.
Missile event. I
agree. That's a valid event. You have 2 for track 0001.
Today's Air Force fights missile defense war games in which so-called rogue nations attack American cities.
Possible impact in San Francisco, sir.
In reality, who would launch such attacks against the USA?
The interesting thing is that the threat is actually shrinking, not increasing. The ballistic missile threat is declining. There are far fewer ballistic missiles in the world now than there were 15 years ago. There are fewer countries with ballistic missile programs. There are fewer hostile countries to the United States with ballistic missile programs. When you look at it, it really comes down to a handful of states whose programs we worry about, North Korea and Iran, basically, and they only have medium-range missiles. That is, they can't reach the United States.
From Ronald Reagan onwards, every president has secured funding for missile defense under various guises, using various funds, for a total of at least $200 billion. Are U.S. taxpayers getting what they pay for?
It's a con. It's a con. Missile defense is the greatest fraud in the Department of Defense, and believe me, it's had a lot of competitors. I really believe this. Missile defense is the longest-running fraud in the history of the U.S. Department of Defense.
If a ballistic strike is implausible, why repel it at such cost? From space. What if missile defense disguised ambitions broader than destroying only missiles?
There's going to be an inherent anti-satellite capability with any ballistic missile defense system, regardless of whether it's located in space or elsewhere. And I think that that's effectively unavoidable. Targeting a ballistic missile in some senses is more difficult than targeting a satellite. And therefore, targeting a satellite is almost always a capability that's associated with missile defense system.
In February 2008, the United States destroyed a disabled satellite of its own with missile defense interceptors. The U.S. demonstrated that these interceptors, also called kill vehicles, can obliterate any satellite in low Earth orbit.
Missile defense is a Trojan horse. It has nothing to do with defense whatsoever. It's all about projecting power. It's about offense. I've been to the bases in Colorado Springs, and I've personally seen over the door where it says Master of Space. And I've read the documents, Vision for 2020, and a whole array of other military Space Command documents that have said for years that the U.S. will control space, that we will dominate space, that we will deny other countries access to space. We, 5% of the world's population in the United States, are going to deny other countries access to space. I mean, absolutely provocative.
I would tell you that we are so dominant in space that I pity a country that would come up against us. The synergy with air, land, and sea forces and our ability to control the battle space and seize the high ground is devastating.
We're gonna roll 38 add ascension. Ascension 8, AFTAC arms open. Time is good.
You have no open jobs, this until 1727.
America now has the chance to establish an American empire, Pax Americana, that will last for many, many decades. And one of the ways to do this is to establish strong American control of space.
By advancing space weaponry, the United States nurtures its economy and its sphere of control. It guards interests at home and to the outermost frontiers, in the tradition of empires.
If you look at history, countries, including the United States, had to at first develop armies to defend themselves. So the United States needed an army to defend itself against the indigenous population who we were exterminating as we expanded across the national territory, and to defend ourselves against Mexico, and we stole half of Mexico, and so on and so forth. For that, you needed armies, and also intervention and so on. And then countries also developed navies, like, the British had to develop a navy to defend themselves against people in India and Africa and so on. And as they describe it, they're pretty frank about it. They say they had to develop navies to protect commercial interests and investment, and same with us. And now there's a new frontier, space, and we have to move on to control space in order to protect commercial interests and investments.
Welcome to the future. The place you go when you say, here's to bigger profits, better business, brighter prospects, and a bottom line that just won't quit. Think big. Big tax advantages, big business opportunities, big profits. And the hottest Fortune 500 industries in the world are taking advantage of them. Which means whether you're looking to relocate, expand, or conquer the known universe with your own special vision of the capitalist's dream, they can help make it happen.
Please welcome Creator of Air Force Base, General Kevin Chilton.
It's nice to be here in Colorado Springs for this great gathering. I think it's fitting that we're here in Colorado because I think it was, I know it was 25 years ago when the first commander of Air Force Space Command stood up the flag here, General James Hardinger. He said that Colorado Springs would become the nation's military space capital, and indeed it has.
In Colorado Springs, you will find a different kind of base of both direct military and military contractors approaching 1/3 of the entire population. And when you think about it, that is a big number.
The industrialists are now saying, we're not going to make cars anymore. We're not going to make clothes in America anymore. We're not going to make this and that in America anymore. We're going to make weapons.
This is our space tracking surveillance system, and this is a more advanced version of a missile detection satellite to detect, track, and discriminate missiles in flight. So this finds them, somebody else shoots them down.
Here at Lockheed Martin, we have all kinds of cool stuff.
We're working on some of the world's most important and spectacular technologies, and we're the best in the world at what we do.
While most U.S. industries struggle to endure a recession, the weaponization of space still feeds thriving corporations with contracts.
Keep on riding.
Now here on our right, we see one of the new guys in town, SI International. Companies that are growing very quickly that no one has heard of before, such as L3 Communications, Sparta. These are names that are not familiar names to people, and yet they are the new strong players in military contractors. You have the Aerospace Corporation on your right. You have Mitre Corporation on your left. As we cross over here, you will see a Lockheed Martin plant. Now here to our right is Northrop Grumman. Northrop Grumman has always been a big contractor, but a couple of years ago, it bought out TRW Corporation. And so now it is one of the biggest military contractors in the world. This is the kind of new growth we are seeing in Colorado Springs.
Out of every tax dollar in the United States today, 50 cents out of every single tax dollar goes to the Pentagon. For past wars, for current wars, for future wars. We are being made into a warrior culture, if you will.
Nearly 750,000 remarkable individuals serving their country. And they all believe they have the best job in the world.
How cool is it to be able to go home at night and tell your kids that you fly satellites at geosynchronous orbit? That is great stuff. How cool is it to know that you operate the most powerful radars in the planet and surveil the heavens, that you operate telescopes that are critical to national defense? How cool is it to tell people that you are responsible for maintaining nuclear missiles on alert for the defense of this country? This is a cool business that we are in.
Join us. America's Air Force. No one comes close.
This is our larger laboratory, and off to this side we have freshmen or first-year cadets working on components of our FalconSat 5 satellite that we're in the process of designing, and we'll be testing those at Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico.
Since I was a kid, I've been fascinated with aviation and space exploration. So after high school, I started looking at colleges, and the Air Force looked really cool because I could learn about space technology and satellite design, so the Air Force Academy was just the natural choice.
Freeze it!
Freeze it!
Pops!
Space. Look at number 4.
Right there.
Earth 4.
Okay.
Awesome. We're at the Air Force Starbase La Luz Academy at Kirtland Air Force Base, and we've got students working on a engineering piece of software to design a space station. So if they were trying to present their model to somebody to buy or to be excited about.
Oh, that's cool.
There are all kinds of stories across the country now where young people in their schools are being indoctrinated at very young ages in this warrior culture and in new space technology.
Each year, over 50,000 children are educated in space technology at military bases in most states across the U.S. The Pentagon takes a long-term view, seeking to enlist generations of youth in richly subsidized aerospace careers.
It's extremely important for us to have students learning about science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. As our workforce continues to age, we need to make sure that we have young people in the pipeline that are interested in filling those career slots that our current scientists and engineers are in.
I would argue there is no better time than today for us all to commit to a future of excellence and leadership fueled by the next generation of our airmen. Ladies and gentlemen, we're ready today. With our great industry partners, with you at our side, we'll be ready for tomorrow. God bless you, and thank you very much.
The Pentagon has said that moving the arms race into space will be the largest industrial project in the history of the planet Earth. They can't take any chances. They have to have an enemy. They have to make the people afraid. Someone's going to attack us with nuclear weapons. We've got to have missile defense in order to protect us from attack. Iraq, one of the rogue states, Iran, North Korea, and now they throw China into that equation.
Wait a minute. What about the Chinese threat? Didn't China, like the US, show that it can destroy orbiting satellites? Isn't China trying to gain military superiority in space?
The threat to our space security is real.
Kind of an electronic Pearl Harbor that could only be aimed at the United States.
There are individuals who are hyping the Chinese threat, saying that it's imminent, that it's aggressive, that they plan to launch a preemptive, massive attack on U.S. space systems in the Pacific, which they call a space Pearl Harbor. And they often look for these stories, these sensational stories in newspapers or tabloids, and these publications tend not to be very reliable. For example, this Parasite satellite story, where a Hong Kong tabloid published a bit of information it got off of a Chinese website, and then this made it into U.S. Pentagon reports to Congress. And nobody ever bothered to figure out if this original Chinese website source was credible or not. And as it turns out, the person who was posting this, it was on his personal web page, his sort of own personal blog. And he was really just sort of making it up. And if you look at all of the other things on his site, which include things like pictures of, scantily clad women and sensational photographs of secret weapon systems, he's clearly not a credible source of information. They didn't bother to trace the information to its source, which took us about 6 hours to do.
For the last 3 years, the Pentagon has been trying to make China the new boogeyman, and China unwittingly played into the United States' hands with its anti-satellite test.
At the time, I was at a conference in Colorado Springs, and the military officers in the room actually left to watch the test in real time. So they were observing the actual Chinese anti-satellite test.
We know about every space launch. We know about every rocket launch. We have reconnaissance and surveillance satellites that can detect all these. We detected the Chinese test, for example, and in fact, we detected the 2 previous Chinese tests that failed. So we know about this. It's extremely difficult to hide space tests. They're one of the most observable weapons tests you can possibly imagine.
What was the point of China's display of destruction?
The reason is simple. They want to give you a signal, a warning. So the warning must be known by the other side.
In effect, the Chinese were saying, okay, you want to be dominant in space? You deal with us.
China intended to alert the world to U.S. plans for military dominance of space. And China warned, it will confront that ambition. It is able and willing to destroy U.S. weapons in space.
We wouldn't really want to see, in the future, an Earth surrounded by an outer layer of weapons, which will make mankind even more vulnerable than the situation today.
China offered a preview of the deadly contest that would start if the U.S. positions weapons in space. How close is that risk?
The U.S. military is developing what the Air Force in particular has called prompt global strike. That is basically, currently we have nuclear missiles that could strike anywhere on Earth within 30 minutes. What the military is talking about is a similar conventional capability that could be used to knock out, say, a Chinese anti-satellite weapons launcher in a matter of minutes. A number of concepts are being studied with this notion of prompt global strike. One is a orbiting space plane that would have the capability to be able to maneuver and also to fire weapons at a much faster pace than is currently the case. Another is a space satellite that would actually have missiles on it that could be fired from space and reach a target in literally 5 to 10 minutes as opposed to the current 30 minutes.
We're talking about a satellite system called Rods from God, which can put heavy tungsten metal rods from satellites onto the Earth to penetrate bunkers. All that's being developed. We've spent billions of dollars on research on these weapons, and a number of these weapons are getting ready for testing.
Were they deployed in orbit, global strike systems could hit 100 targets on Earth at once, at nearly 7,000 miles an hour. They wouldn't be weapons of mass destruction, as defined in UN resolutions, but the destructive impact of a rod from God would match that of a nuclear warhead.
Satellites can identify a target through overhead imagery, process communications about the target between military decision makers, and then guide a bomb precisely enough to destroy the target with one shot. Would it really be that big a step if a projectile itself were also launched from space? There's no practical difference, and I'd venture to say that the person on the receiving end wouldn't see the distinction either.
In the high-tech field, there's a notion called normal accident. It means the kind of accident that is going to take place unpredictably in any complicated system. Like anyone who owns a computer knows about normal accidents. Every once in a while, the thing just crashes for some unexplained reason. And when you get to much more complex systems, of course that's going to happen.
With all our technology, we know bloody well that we cannot be assured absolutely 100% that our bombs, so-called think bombs, smart bombs, are hitting the targets. We know from Afghanistan and Iraq alone in the last few years that that's a fallacy.
You are hitting civilian people. You are not hitting the Iraqi bases. What you are doing is wrong.
How much worse would the probability of hitting the wrong target or hitting ourselves from outer space would be? We have no way of calculating that. It's not possible. At least one weapon could go awry and land in Iowa or New York City or God knows where, you know. That's a reality. And if we don't accept that, well, we're just whistling in the dark. And we're going to be victims of our own technology.
The rest of the world understands that the U.S. is planning to militarize space, of course. So there have been efforts to renew and extend the Outer Space Treaty. It says weapons of mass destruction can't be in space. It doesn't say other things. And there have been attempts to renew it, just to affirm it and to strengthen it. The U.S. blocks it every year.
It is 160 to 1, 170 to 1. The United States is the only nation actually voting against this. We're isolated on this issue.
It would be nice to think that space weaponization is prevented not because there's a huge outcry against it, although that would be an interesting prospect too, but because no one, including our own nation, has the money to spend on this anymore. But in an era when the United States still maintains a $500 billion military budget every year, I don't think we can count on that happening.
It's really insane. We are willing to spend hundreds of billions of dollars over the years to develop space control means that a treaty would take care of, would make unnecessary. If we had the will to negotiate such a treaty, if we took the lead, we could get one. It wouldn't be easy. It would be a very difficult thing to do, but it could be done.
How can a treaty ban all anti-satellite weaponry? A ground-based laser, a conventional missile, and most orbiting systems can be used to demolish satellites. Could a treaty guarantee that kill vehicles would only target missiles, not satellites or Earth-bound objects? Opponents of a new treaty argue that such promises are untenable, and too late.
Weaponization of space has happened a long time ago. This idea that it's a pristine environment, that if only we stop where we are right now, all will be well, is simply nonsense. And it's even more foolish to think that somehow we can stuff this genie into a bottle.
We do indeed need a United Nations treaty. This is not enough. This is only step one. Step two says, okay, space has been militarized. There are military networks in space. Many of them, like GPS, are useful, but we should work on international treaties to make those military space networks used for multilateral purposes. Do I think that's going to happen? I'm very doubtful, but I have to keep hoping and believing that there is a prospect for that.
cut tens of billions of dollars in wasteful spending. I will cut investments in unproven missile defense systems. I will not weaponize space.
Those fearing the weaponization of space could find hope in Barack Obama's election. As soon as he took office, the White House announced it would be seeking a worldwide ban on weapons that interfere with military and commercial satellites. But it proved tough to change decades of entrenched military policy to weaponize space. Obama's 2010 defense budget requested close to $1 billion that was applicable to space warfare systems. It included a new program called Offensive Counterspace, which the Pentagon defined as offensive measures to disrupt, deny, degrade, or destroy any adversary's space capabilities.
History suggests that nations do not voluntarily disarm. They disarm because they're defeated, or they make small adjustments in the way they buy and build and deploy their weapons. But no superpower says, you know, it would be better if we were weaker. I don't recall that ever happening.
Yeah! 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11.
It's hard to obtain space superiority without attacking, so I'm afraid that if we want space superiority, we're going to have to attack enemy's assets, which I don't know if you know much about orbital mechanics, but if you created debris up in space, that would just get in the way for you as well, and it kind of started a chain reaction, and pretty soon you just have a cloud of debris surrounding Earth.
About 600,000 fragments rush through space at 10 times the velocity of a rifle bullet.
All of these objects are traveling at 14,000 miles an hour. So even an object the size of a pea traveling at that speed has more force than a cannonball.
Right now, the problem with space junk is so high that NASA is worried that if there is never another launch of anything into space, because every launch creates a little bit of debris, in 50 years' time, certain orbits will be so polluted that nobody can operate there, because the stuff that's already up there will start breaking up and creating more and more clutter.
A satellite's destruction unleashes a storm cloud of debris that fouls the space around our planet and threatens anything in orbit.
The point really is creation of debris in this manner a good idea or a bad idea? And clearly it is a very bad idea, because there's no way to go up and clean that up.
The more times you go into space and you begin to practice destroying other satellites, you create so much space junk that you literally create the very likely possibility that at some point in time you will not be able to get a rocket off the planet Earth, because it'll be like a minefield around the planet. And you won't be able to escape the minefield with that rocket because it would be destroyed by all the space junk there. So we've got to begin to look at space as an environment.
We have several $100 billion of investment in the peaceful uses of outer space. I'm talking about weather satellites, positioning satellites, scientific satellites. The entire world communication network is all satellite-oriented. All this incredible investment from the United States and from the European Union and Canada and other countries like this, all this is completely at jeopardy if we start putting weapons in outer space.
How would our world change if we lost the use of satellites? Day 1, 6:15 a.m. Communication satellites hovering over the Americas fall mute. Over a swath of the globe, GPS coverage collapses. Atomic clocks on GPS satellites can't transmit Universal Standard Time. The synchronization of massive infrastructures snaps. 350 million cell phones are disabled. Hundreds of millions of internet connections vanish. Around the world, card payments and bank accounts freeze. Billions of dollars are sucked from industries and businesses, triggering a financial crash. News services are crippled. City streets reliant on GPS for traffic management are in chaos. Electrical grids lose synchronization. Wide zones of continents are blinded by blackouts. Coast guards are deaf to ships' distress calls. Dozens of aircraft are missing. Air traffic controllers are fighting panic. Worldwide, flights are grounded or called back. By midnight, there's been a cascade of traffic, train, boat, and aircraft accidents. So far, the world has avoided such a catastrophe. But a space war would kill satellites and blast tons of wreckage into orbit. The system we rely on would shatter and be impossible to restore.
The time is 6:25, and this is a special as part of the Conference on World Affairs. We're discussing the militarization of space.
There is a point in time that may be rapidly closing where the United States could dominate space to such a point where there would be no arms race.
Frankly, I don't think it's doable. I think the march of technology will mean that even if we get a lead on other nations in attempting to do that, that sooner or later we will again be challenged.
It's kind of like what happened after World War II. We had the atomic bomb, nobody else had the atomic bomb. We thought we had a big exclusive, and with our atomic weaponry, we would be able to dominate the Earth. It didn't last very long. The Soviets had an atomic bomb. The Chinese had an atomic. Likewise in space, to think that we can move up there with weaponry and be alone to be the king on the throne of space is a tragic miscalculation.
Tout le monde trouve que l'idée de faire de l'armement de l'espace est une idée dangereuse à terme qui ne pourra qu'inciter d'autres pays à leur tour à participer à cet armement spatial.
India has been discussing whether or not it needs to build its own anti-satellite weapons. You can be sure if India does it, Pakistan will be thinking about it in a heartbeat as well. Israel has also been discussing this issue. So what you see now is the potential for a domino effect.
Few nations will willingly submit to U.S. supremacy in space. Some will try to topple the U.S. Others scramble for a foothold. Enemies will vie in leaping ahead. Stable and unstable nations will be dragged into the race. The European Union opposes the weaponization of space. But for how long?
Si les Américains continuent de placer des armes, non plus des satellites militaires, mais des armes dans l'espace, il va peut-être falloir qu'on y réfléchisse et qu'on envisage au moins les moyens de se défendre ou de faire face, alors on ne dit pas à la menace américaine, mais à l'éventuelle course aux armements qui pourrait en découler.
Russia would plunge into the contest. It has committed to destroying any weapon the U.S. positions in orbit.
If Americans deploy space-based anti-ballistic missile defenses, then could you imagine interceptors based on space stations, military stations, would overfly territory of Russia or territory of China? That would be considered as quite unacceptable, I think, for Russians.
The potential victims are not going to say, here's my throat, please cut it. And they know that they're a potential target, and if the U.S. were to develop space weapons, they'd be completely defenseless unless they destroyed it somehow or developed a deterrent. And deterrents are known. So, for example, nuclear weapons are a deterrent. Terror is a deterrent. That's why aggressive militarism leads to an extension of proliferation and terror.
«Звездные войны», как известно, уже не фантастика.
реальность еще в середине 80-х годов, такая политика является, конечно, катализатором гонки вооружений. Доминирование фактора силы неизбежно подпитывает тягу ряда стран к обладанию оружием массового уничтожения. Милитаризация космоса, по мнению России, может спровоцировать непредсказуемые для мирового сообщества последствия. Не меньшие, чем начало ядерной эры.
During the Cold War, humankind feared that in a series of blinding flashes, the world would become an untended graveyard. Thousands of nuclear weapons are still maintained around the world on hair trigger alert. The weaponization of space could detonate this arsenal.
So any anxiety induced by putting weapons in space or launching weapons from space down to Earth could induce, by accident, by human fallibility, by design, by terrorist takeover, the launching of up to 9,000 hydrogen bombs, inducing a short ice age and the death of most creatures on the planet. We're on the edge of the nuclear precipice, about to be annihilated.
If we move to weaponization of space, we can bid farewell to the planet. The chances of survival are very slight.
When you, all your life, have been told that America is an exceptional nation, that we are different from the rest, when you're told that all your life, you begin to believe it. I was in the Air Force. I was a young Republican for Nixon. And I grew up on the military bases behind the barbed wire fences. And so everything I really was taught and was trained in was militarism and a conservative way of being, conservative way of seeing the world. But now I personally have learned that what America is doing is not about defense, it's about offense. It's about an aggressive military doctrine that talks about control and domination. I really went through an entire transformation. Everything that I knew was different, but one thing wasn't different. One thing always remained. I realized I had a good heart, even as a conservative, as a young follower of the military. I had a good heart. I had a good intention. And I realized that many people in the military are that way, that they have a good heart. They mean well. They're doing what they think is the right thing to do. They want to protect the country.
There are moments that will truly test the leader within you. Test whether you will take the hard path or the easy path, the wrong path or the right path.
Most people want to have a good heart, and that when you challenge them to think, it doesn't mean that they change overnight. I didn't change overnight. It took me some time behind those gates on that military base for me to make my change, but it's all about initiating that change.
The willingness always to take the right path, even if it's the hard path, is called character. In every aspect of your life, whether personal or professional, you must always maintain the courage of your convictions, your personal integrity.
We're living in a very, very dangerous time, and there's hardly any alarm in this area across the board. I mean, people are just, they're so inundated with so many things, you know, just making a living, just getting through the day, just trying to remain sane in all this insanity that's going on. That it's hard to get their attention and saying, wait a minute, I know you think it's bad. I got news for you, it's a lot worse. People don't want to hear that, you know. So we have to find a way to alert people to the reality of what's going on. and that's not an easy task.
Let's prevent something terrible from happening before it does, for once. Usually we're trying to bring back weapon systems after they've been deployed. Nuclear missiles, we're trying to bring them back. Here's an opportunity, one of the first times in history, actually, that we have a chance to be proactive, that we have a chance to stop a new arms race before it actually happens. That's why this moment is so crucial.
The debate over space weaponization is the most critical debate for the next century. And we are on the verge of making decisions in many nations around the world about which path to choose.
Congratulations, and may God watch over all of you and these United States.
Lord, we pray today that you would allow us to worship you in spirit and in truth as we go out into the world.
Can the high ground that nations seek be the moral high ground? Or are we doomed to pursue only the high ground of military advantage? Many nations are showing themselves unwilling to find global peace under the command of one. Can the U.S. show leadership rather than strive for supremacy? Rather than insisting on a Pax Americana, can the U.S. steer a union of nations towards a Pax Universalis, a peace for all the world?
In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
What kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on Earth worth living. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time.